Inventing the Future. Postcapitalism and a World Without Work. By Nick Srnicek and Alex Williams. Chapter 2. Why Aren't We Winning? A Critique of Today's Left. Goldman Sachs doesn't care if you raise chickens. Jody Dean. A key challenge facing the left today is to reckon with the disappointments and failures of the most recent cycle of struggles. From the anti-globalization to the Occupy movements, we have seen a high point of folk political practice. Why, despite a considerable mobilization of people and passions, did these movements fail to achieve any significant change in the political status quo? Some writers have argued that the incapacity of contemporary leftist movements can be explained by their class basis, such as their alleged lack of a working-class component, or the infiltration of reformist liberal interests. Others have argued that the problem lies with the nature of the system and the hurdles placed in front of any transformative project. Yet, as we argued last chapter, this only partly explains the recent failures. By contrast, the argument of this chapter is that the problems lie more with the folk political assumptions that shape the strategic horizon of recent left politics. We seek here to diagnose the limits posed by contemporary folk politics. As was argued in Chapter 1, folk politics emerges at the junction between a generalized reaction to increasing social complexity and a specific history of leftist movements in the 20th century. This chapter examines how the folk political intuitions that were formed in the process have come to shape some of the dominant strands of contemporary leftist politics. We make no claim to cover the entire field of social movements here, but simply focus on what have been the most politically popular and significant moments of the radical left in the past 15 years. We also do not claim that any of the particular political tactics used by these movements are inherently problematic. The merits of particular tactics are only legible when seen in the context of both the broader historical horizon and the strategy aimed at transforming it. It is in our current setting, of a world overwhelmingly determined by the imperatives of global capitalism, combined with folk political strategies focused on the local and the spontaneous, that we locate the fundamental weakness of the contemporary left. We begin by examining one of the most popular political tendencies of the past 15 years, horizontalism, before turning to widespread ideas centered on localism, and the general reactive thrust of most mainstream and radical leftist politics. Horizontalism. Crystallizing in 1970s U.S. social movements and thrust into prominence by the Zapatistas, alter-globalization activists and the movement of the squares, horizontalism has become the dominant strand of today's radical left. Responding to the 20th century failures of state-led political change, horizontalist movements instead advocate changing the world by changing social relations from below. They draw upon a long tradition of theory and practice in anarchism, council communism, libertarian communism and autonomism, in order to, in the words of one proponent, change the world without taking power. At the heart of these movements lies a rejection of the state and other formal institutions, and a privileging of society as the space from which radical change will emerge. Horizontalism rejects the project of hegemony as intrinsically domineering, putting forth an affinity-based politics in its stead. Rather than advocating an appeal to or takeover of the vertical power of the state, horizontalism argues for freely associating individuals to come together, create their own autonomous communities and govern their own lives. In broad terms, we can summarize these ideas in terms of four major commitments. 1. A rejection of all forms of domination. 2. An adherence to direct democracy or consensus decision-making. 3. A commitment to prefigurative politics. 4. An emphasis on direct action. Embedded within this set of commitments is a series of problems that constrain and limit their potential in the struggle against global capitalism. Horizontalism's focus on domination in all its forms is perhaps its signal contribution. Moving beyond the old left's traditional focus on the state and capital, it emphasizes the various ways in which other types of domination continue to structure society: racial, patriarchal, sexual, ableist, and so on. It is a significant advance that many of today's radical left have adopted these ideas and centered their practice upon the complete removal of all forms of oppression, a commitment that we believe any serious leftist politics must adopt. Yet the means by which horizontalist movements attempt to overcome domination and oppression often end up being bound by the limits of folk politics. In seeking the direct and unmediated cancellation of social relations of domination, these movements either tend to ignore the more subtle forms of domination that persist, or else fail to construct persistent political structures able to maintain the new social relations in the long term. The commitment to avoiding all forms of domination is closely tied to a critique of representation, both conceptual and political. In practice, this has led to a rejection of the more hierarchical structures that characterize representative politics. Having experienced the history of corrupt trade unions and rapidly eroded liberal democracies, representation is seen as inevitably leading to self-serving and dominant elites. These structures are to be replaced by direct forms of democracy that privilege immediacy over mediation, invoking a more personal sense of politics. The idea here is that a face-to-face democracy is presumably more natural and authentic, and less prone to the emergence of hierarchies. Political decisions are to be made not by representatives, but instead by individuals representing themselves in person. Direct democracy ends up being taken as a basic value, underpinned by the folk political intuition that what is immediate is better than what is mediated. Rather than majority rule, parliamentary procedure, or dictates from a central committee, it is consensus that is often the major aim of discussions. Debate and governance should therefore be maximally inclusive, and the process of deliberation itself, as opposed to just its outcomes, is something to be valued. Participatory democracy is understandably a major attraction for many people, particularly in light of the empty, ritualistic gestures of contemporary representative democracies. Many participants speak of the feelings of empowerment they derive from participating in consensus decision-making processes. Maximal inclusivity and consensus are therefore valorized, and the importance of tactics and process is placed above strategic objectives. Direct democracy, consensus and inclusivity all form part of horizontalism's commitments to prefigurative politics, which aims to create in the here and now the world they would like to see. Prefigurative politics is a long-standing tradition on the left, from the anarchism of Kropotkin and Bakunin onwards, but it has only recently come to characterize the leading edges of left-wing politics. The earlier promise that, after the revolution, hierarchies and exclusions would evaporate was little consolation to the women and people of color whose concerns were ignored by yet another white male leader. Rather than wait for a purported revolution, prefigurative politics attempts to instantiate a new world immediately, again relying on an implicit sense that immediacy is inherently superior to more mediated approaches. At its best, prefigurative politics attempts to embody utopian impulses in bringing the future into concrete existence today. Yet at its worst, an insistence on prefiguration becomes a dogmatic assertion that the means must match the ends, accompanied by ignorance of the structural forces set against it. If the aim is to create the world we want in the here and now, and if recourse to mediating institutions is forbidden, or at least disavowed, then the appropriate form of practice has to be direct action. This is a form of practice that encompasses a wide range of possible tactics, ranging from theatrical protests in the vein of the Situationists, to wildcat strikes, to blockading ports, to burning down luxury housing developments. In these practices we can again see hints of folk politics, the privileging of the direct, the immediate and the intuitive. To be sure, direct action can sometimes be more effective and useful than protests, such as pouring concrete to destroy anti-homeless spikes, or using slow-down methods in workplace struggles. Yet, as we will see, direct action often remains insufficient to secure long-standing change, and in isolation, is typically only a temporary impediment to the powers of state and capital. Direct democracy, prefigurative politics, and direct action are not, we hasten to add, intrinsically flawed. Rather than being denounced in themselves, their utility needs to be judged relative to particular historical situations and particular strategic objectives, in terms of their ability to exert real power to create genuine lasting transformation. The reality of complex, globalized capitalism is that small interventions consisting of relatively non-scalable actions are highly unlikely to ever be able to reorganize our socio-economic system. As we suggest in the second half of this book, the tactical repertoire of horizontalism can have some use, but only when coupled with other more mediated forms of political organization and action. Following this broad overview of horizontalism's theoretical commitments and the general issues associated with them, we can now turn to two important sequences in 21st century politics to highlight both the practical possibilities and the strong folk political limits built into these models. In what follows, we examine two of the strongest cases for horizontalism: the Occupy movement emerging after the 2008 financial crisis and the Argentinian experience in the wake of the country's 2001 default. In each case, we can see both the real successes and the palpable limits of these approaches. Occupy. The most significant recent embodiment of horizontalist principles occurred in the movement of the squares. While occupations do not require horizontalist governance, indeed, the precursors to the tactic originally came from the military, the vast majority of post-2008 occupations have been organized along such lines. This wave of occupations of public spaces spread rapidly to over 950 cities worldwide in 2011, each inflected with local political, economic, cultural and class concerns. Here we want to examine the failure of the Occupy movement in the Western world, in particular because it highlights the deficiencies of folk political thinking in the core capitalist countries. Notably, this failure occurred despite the vast range of approaches subsumed under the name of Occupy. In the United States, for example, from Occupy Wall Street to Occupy Oakland, this movement ranged from the dogmatically nonviolent to the openly antagonistic, between an often confused liberalism and a militant libertarian communism. Adding to this regional variation was the mixed ideological makeup of the participants, which spanned the political spectrum and included reformist liberals, anti-capitalists, insurrectionist anarchists, anti-state communists and union activists, along with a smattering of anti-Federal Reserve libertarians. In addition to this diversity, there was widespread resistance to the articulation of political demands, making the unity of the movement even more difficult to discern. It is relatively easy to see why so many were motivated to join the movement. The horizontalist nature of Occupy gave people a means to express themselves in the face of societies that barely registered their voices. Particularly in America, the structure of electoral democracy around two large parties has meant the window of political discourse has become incredibly narrow. The assortment of slogans and causes associated with Occupy testifies to an explosion of suppressed anger and a proliferation of political demands that otherwise went unheard. Even among those who did not directly participate in the occupations, Occupy provided a platform for the excluded in websites such as the We Are the 99% Tumblr, with a chorus of voices protesting against economic immiseration and social exclusion. Beyond any direct political result, the opportunity for the frustrations of the excluded to be publicly aired was inspiring and empowering for many. Occupy also worked to disrupt the ordinary lives of both participants and observers, and allowed people to participate together in a shared political project. In the words of one observer, the practice of autonomy provides a lesson in one's own power. In places such as Oakland, activists frequently pushed towards more radical politics than the usual mediating organizations, such as non-profits, would have allowed. Occupy functioned, like many protest movements, as a way to radicalize those who were involved, especially when they were faced with disproportionately brutal police responses. Occupations were purported to prefigure a new world, but even if that new world has yet to emerge, the movement certainly showed participants what was possible with political solidarity. Beyond these internal benefits, occupied spaces functioned as bases for actions against the political system, as in protest camps against the G8. The majority of these actions consisted of protest marches and rallies, with the spaces also operating as physical locations for collective decision-making. In relation to external actions, occupied spaces also worked as headquarters for skills training, for example, carrying out acts of civil disobedience, dealing with police repression or providing information on legal rights. In a general sense, occupations worked as the most obvious real-world manifestation of the infrastructure for the overall movement. The occupations were also, though not always, a place for supporting the most marginal sections of society, particularly the homeless. Perhaps most importantly, the occupations provided an insistent focal point for media attention, particularly the Zuccotti Park occupation in New York, and brought many otherwise sidelined issues to the attention of the government and the wider public. At least for a limited time, Occupy was able to draw significant mainstream press and television news attention to issues of economic justice, a real achievement in a heavily neoliberalized media environment. But despite these successes, there are important ways in which the occupations failed. Numerous commentators from within the movement have already noted a number of these, including the ways in which Occupy's rhetoric of inclusivity hid a series of exclusions based on race, gender, income, and free time. Folk political constraints were contained in the practices and ideas of the movement, and it was these tendencies that ultimately left it incapable of expanding spatially, consolidating temporally, or universalizing itself. To be sure, some of the movements that made up Occupy had no intention of scaling up, persisting in time, or universalizing themselves. Many, though not all, horizontalist thinkers place an emphasis on the particular dynamism of relatively short-lived, spontaneous politics, holding that relative permanence is not necessarily a virtue. But whether intended or not, the movement's tendency and practice to prioritize spatial, temporal, and conceptual immediacy weakened it collectively, leaving it unable to persist long enough to have a chance of seriously pursuing its basic objectives. Drawing upon horizontalist principles, the Occupy movement was characterized chiefly by its adherence to direct democracy. While direct democracy can exist in a variety of different forms, from workers' councils to Swiss-style canton democracy, under Occupy it took the General Assembly as the dominant organizational form. In an era of declining democratic effectiveness, a new way of doing democracy was one of the most common aspirations articulated by participants in these protests. Still, when fetishized as an end in itself, direct democracy inexorably imposes significant constraints. In the first place, the level of effort and involvement in politics that direct democracy demands leads to problems of sustainability. The participatory economics, project, for instance, envisions direct democracy at every level of society, but this vision for a post-capitalist world translates into endlessly ramifying staff meetings over every detail of life, hardly the inspiring stuff of utopian visions. Under Occupy, many general assemblies devolved into similar situations in which even the most mundane of issues had to be painstakingly addressed by a collective. The acrimonious debates over drummers making too much noise in the Zuccotti Park occupation are just one particularly farcical example of this. The more general point is that direct democracy requires a significant amount of participation and effort, in other words, it entails increasing amounts of work. During brief moments of revolutionary enthusiasm, this extra work can become inconsequential, yet after the return to normality it is simply added to the ordinary pressures of everyday life. The extra work of direct democracy is problematic especially because of the constitutive exclusions it entails, particularly for those who are unable to attend physically, those who do not feel comfortable in large groups, and those who lack public speaking skills, with all the gendered and racialized biases inherent to these factors. As the Occupy movement went on, the General Assemblies simply collapsed, often under the weight of exhaustion and boredom. The conclusion to be drawn from this is that the problem of democracy today is not that people want a say over every single aspect of their lives. The real issue of democratic deficit is that the most significant decisions of society are out of the hands of the average person. Direct democracy responds to this problem, but attempts to solve it by making democracy an immediate and bodily experience that rejects mediation. Similar preferences for immediacy in democracy also hold back its spatial scalability. To put it simply, direct democracy requires small communities. It is notable that the hundreds of thousands in Tahrir Square in Egypt did not have a General Assembly, and that even at Occupy Wall Street, the General Assembly consisted of only a small proportion of the total number of participants. The very mechanisms and ideals of direct democracy, face-to-face discussion, make it difficult for it to exist beyond small communities, and make it virtually impossible to respond to problems of national, regional and global democracy. The spatial constraints of direct democracy also overlook the regressive aspects of small communities. These intimate communities are often home to the most virulent forms of xenophobia, homophobia, racism, pernicious gossip, and all other varieties of backward thinking. Small communities of the kind required by direct democracy are not a suitable goal for a modern left movement. Moreover, participative democracy might well be constructed without them, particularly using the communications technologies available today. Another folk political constraint emerged with the emphasis on consensus as a basic goal of the process. The aim of consensus is to reach a decision that is acceptable to everyone, again reliant upon spatial immediacy. As anarchist David Graeber notes, it is much easier, in a face-to-face community, to figure out what most members of that community want to do, than to figure out how to convince those who do not to go along with it. Yet what works well on one scale, the face-to-face community, is much more difficult to make work on larger ones. Perhaps inevitably in the case of a relatively diffuse movement such as Occupy, consensus decision-making led to a lowest common denominator set of demands, where they emerged at all. There was also much rhetoric glorifying the absence of determinate demands as somehow radical. These arguments from within the movement identified the making of demands as alienating and divisive, as potentially reducing the role of the movement by appealing to outside powers, such as the state, and hence liable to lead towards the co-optation of the movement. As critics of such views have argued, however, the divisive nature of demands is also a positive. While putting some participants off, they may equally mobilize those committed to achieving the demand in question. Moreover, they work to clarify the real political differences contained in the movement, differences often elided in practice, even where they might prove to be insurmountable. Further problems with Occupy emerged with its nominal rejection of any forms of organizational verticality. Most notably, this led to problems emerging in the relations between the movement and other similarly minded groups. Whereas the movement of the squares in Egypt and Tunisia built strong connections with existing labor movements, the Western world's Occupy movement largely rejected such associations. This led to three tendencies. The first was a frequently paralyzing decisional structure. When actions were taken by Occupy, they often came from a subgroup acting on their own, rather than from the General Assembly making a consensus decision. Actions, in other words, did not come from horizontalism. Second, evidence shows that hierarchical organizations are crucial in defending movements against the state. In Occupy, the maintenance of the occupied space against police repression was the result, not of horizontalism, but of vertical institutions that mobilized their members to support the occupation. Similarly, in Egypt, football supporters and religious organizations were central to the defense of Tahrir Square against the violence of the state and reactionaries. Finally, the rejection of verticality in all its forms meant a key mechanism for spatially and temporally expanding the movement was abandoned. Links to labor, social justice, and even political parties would have provided an infrastructure for Occupy to move beyond folk political parameters. Organized workers, for instance, were crucial in Egypt for turning the general protest into a near-general strike, shutting down the country as a result and providing the final blow to the Mubarak regime. Links to political parties have also helped occupations in Iceland, Greece and Spain produce much broader successes. In the end, despite the clear desire to spread Occupy's ideas, and the real success in garnering public attention, the moves necessary to transform the social fabric were never taken. More fundamentally, though, Occupy constrained itself by enforcing a rigidly prefigurative politics. The basic prefigurative gesture is to embody the future world immediately, to change our ways of relating to each other in order to live the post-capitalist future in the present. The role of occupations is a classic example of this. They often self-consciously aim to enact the space of a non-capitalist world through mutual aid, rejections of hierarchy and rigorous direct democracy. Yet these spaces are understood and built as explicitly temporary, not spaces for sustained change or the working out of concrete alternatives, let alone ambitious competitors to global capitalism. Instead, they are short-term spaces containing the transitory experiences of an immediate community. A pamphlet from a precursor to the Occupy movement makes this particularly clear. Quote, "Students who insisted on no demands saw the point of occupation as the creation of a momentary opening in capitalist time and space, a rearrangement that sketched the contours of a new society. We side with this anti-reformist position. While we know these free zones will be partial and transitory, the tensions they expose between the real and the possible can push the struggle in a more radical direction." End quote. The acknowledgement that the occupation will be temporary is here combined with a naive belief that maybe this time it will spark a radical change. Prefigurative spaces face a continuous struggle against dissolution for good reasons. First, they require a variety of logistical supports, including housing, food, sanitation, healthcare, defense, and legal advice. Most of this does not come from within the prefigurative community, but instead relies upon existing capitalist networks. The social reproduction of encampments is difficult even under the most favorable conditions, and even established utopian communities, often religious in nature, typically find it impossible to remain independent and self-sustaining. Second, prefigurative spaces are often subject to state and corporate repression, and if they are not, it is typically because they pose no threat to the existing social order. The Zapatistas, for example, are permitted to exist in relative freedom simply because the state and capital do not see them as a threat. The moment a prefigurative space becomes a threat is the moment when repression weighs down on it, and when its fetishization of horizontalism becomes a serious liability. Prefigurative politics, at its worst, therefore ignores the forces aligned against the creation and expansion of a new world. The simple positing and practicing of a new world is insufficient to overcome these forces, as the repression faced by Occupy demonstrated. The immediate question that must be asked of any prefigurative politics is therefore, how can it be expanded and scaled up? Even granting the problematic assumption that most people would want to live as the Occupy camps did, what efforts might be possible to physically and socially expand these spaces? When theorists face up to this question, vague hand-waving usually ensues. Moments will purportedly resonate with each other, small everyday actions will somehow make a qualitative shift to crack open society, riots and blockades will spread and multiply, experiences will contaminate participants and expand, pockets of prefigurative resistance will just spontaneously erupt. In any case, the difficult task of traversing from the particular to the universal, from the local to the global, from the temporary to the permanent, is elided by wishful thinking. The strategic imperatives to expand, extend and universalize are left unfulfilled. If Occupy was unsuccessful in expanding prefigurative spaces beyond the margins of society, these protest camps could still be useful as launching pads for direct action. Indeed, one of the most notable achievements of the Occupy movement was to establish a social and physical infrastructure that could act as a foundation for direct actions. In countries like Greece and Spain, debt strikes have been organized and picket lines formed for workers without the right to strike. Other Occupy movements supported squatters, provided food for the homeless, set up pirate media, mobilized to prevent evictions, protested against government cuts and provided humanitarian relief after natural disasters. But the influence of Occupy should not be overstated. For instance, many of the successful eviction and foreclosure movements have been extensions of pre-existing work done by movements such as the Black activist-led Take Back the Land. More broadly, The problem is that direct actions generally act on surface effects, patching the wounds of capitalism but leaving the underlying problems and structures intact. Foreclosures continue apace, consumer debt rises to new heights, workers are thrown out into the streets, and the homeless population surges. In the case of Occupy, what became apparent was the limits of a propaganda of the deed. While direct action can have real successes, it remains localized and temporary, and in this it remains folk political. Direct action can be effective in mitigating the worst excesses of capitalism, but it can never address the difficult problem of attacking a globally dispersed abstraction, often focusing instead on intuitive targets. The project of an expansive left, a left aiming to transform capitalism in fundamental ways, remains absent. The image of Occupy that emerges here is of a movement that was wedded to certain assumptions about the benefits of local spaces, small communities, direct democracy and temporary autonomy at the margins of society. In turn, these beliefs rendered the movement incapable of expanding spatially, establishing sustainable transformations and universalizing itself. The Occupy movements achieved real victories in creating solidarity, giving a voice to disenchanted and marginalized people, and raising public awareness. But they nevertheless remained an archipelago of prefigurative islands, surrounded by an implacably hostile capitalist environment. The proximate cause for the movement's failure was state repression, in the form of police clad in riot gear ruthlessly clearing the occupied spaces across the United States. But the structural causes were built into the assumptions and practices of the movement. Without the central focus of the occupied spaces, the movement dispersed and fragmented. Ultimately, the organizational form of these movements could not overcome the problems of scalability and construct a form of persistent power capable of effectively resisting the inevitable reaction from the state. What may work quite well on one scale, perhaps up to 100 people, becomes increasingly difficult to operate effectively when extended beyond that. If a truly ambitious left politics is to take on global actors, the neoliberal capitalist system and its governing institutions, leading governments and their armies and police forces, and an entire planet's worth of corporations and financial entities, then operating beyond the merely local is essential. While there is certainly much to learn from these movements, it is our contention that, on their own, they will remain ineffective at bringing about large-scale change. Argentina. If any case from recent history offers hope for the sufficiency of horizontalism, it would appear to be Argentina, which achieved a large-scale national turn towards horizontalism and expansive worker control over factories. Yet a brief look at the Argentinian experience actually reveals new dimensions to the limits of folk political approaches. In Argentina's circumstances, the immediate imperative for new social organizations came from the collapse of the national economy. Struck by a massive recession in 1998, the economy buckled and lost over a quarter of its GDP by 2002. Tensions reached a peak in December 2001, with government restrictions and financial chaos provoking the people into mass protests. The result was the collapse of the government and an eventual default on their debts. With the government both unable and unwilling to help its population, people were forced to find new ways to provide for themselves. In the wake of these challenges, many of the Argentinian people took it upon themselves to self-organize and create new political and economic structures. To a significant degree, these responses were organized around explicitly horizontalist principles. As with Occupy, there are a variety of benefits that can be identified in the horizontalist organizing of Argentina. Perhaps most importantly, these movements were able to disrupt the common-sense norms of neoliberal society, moving beyond market individualism and negative solidarity. The fostering of bonds between individuals helped to overcome the antagonism that most protests and strikes often face from other parts of society. Like Occupy, but on a broader scale, Argentina's horizontal movements were also quickly able to provide the means for social reproduction under crisis conditions. But while these experiments with horizontalism brought about a number of achievements, its experience also revealed several further problems. Principal among these is the limitations faced by neighborhood assemblies as an organizational form. Modeled on horizontalist principles, the neighborhood assemblies arose in response to the immediate needs and possibilities opened up by the crisis. Like the General Assembly of Occupy, they enabled people to have a newfound voice. But even when joined together in turn neighborhood assemblies, they never approached the point of replacing the state, or of being able to present themselves as a viable alternative. The functions of the state, welfare, healthcare, redistribution, education, and so on, were not about to be replaced by the horizontalist movement, even at its height of participation. It thus remained a localized response to the crisis. Further limitations surfaced as these assemblies could only function by either rejecting organized, which is to say, collective, interests, or incorporating them, and thus being overwhelmed. Collective interests were incapable of being brought into the decision-making process without breaking it, since they often took control over discussion and debate. Problematically, these assemblies operated best on an individualistic basis. Other organizational experiments in Argentina involved the spread of worker-controlled factories. In the wake of the economic crisis, some shuttered businesses were taken over and maintained by their employees. These factories helped to keep workers in jobs, and there is some evidence that they provided better pay for their workers. Unfortunately, despite the attention given to them, the total number of people involved was relatively small. In the most optimistic estimates, there were around 250 factories incorporating just under 10,000 workers. With a labor force of over 18 million, this means far less than 0.1% of the economy was participating in worker-controlled factories. Not only were these factories a minor part of the overall economy, but they also remained necessarily embedded within capitalist social relations. The dream of escape is just that, a dream. Tied to the imperative to create a profit, worker-controlled businesses can be just as oppressive and environmentally damaging as any large-scale business, but without the efficiencies of scale. Such problems are widespread across the worker cooperative experience, having arisen not only in Argentina, but also in the Zapatista model and across America. Beyond these organizational limits, the key problem with Argentina as a model for post-capitalism is that it was simply a salve for the problems of capitalism, not an alternative to it. As the economy started to improve, participation in the neighborhood assemblies and alternative economies drastically declined. The post-crisis horizontalist movements in Argentina were built as an emergency response to the collapse of the existing order, not as a competitor to a relatively well-functioning order. Indeed, the more widespread problem with contemporary horizontalism is that it often sees emergency situations, in the wake of a hurricane, earthquake or economic meltdown, as representative of a better world. It is a struggle, to say the least, to see how post-disaster conditions are an improvement for the vast majority of the world's population. A politics that finds its best expression in the breakdown of social and economic order is not an alternative, so much as a knee-jerk survival instinct. Equally problematic is the tendency for horizontalists to find political potential in the mundane ways we organize horizontally in everyday life, friends gathering together, parties, festivals, and so on. The problem is that such modes of organizing are not scalable beyond a small community, and, more to the point, are not useful for certain political goals. As the Argentinian example shows, these modes of organizing can be valuable for basic neighborhood survival and for creating a sense of solidarity between people. But horizontalism struggles to compete against more organized interests, to sustain itself once a base level of normality returns, and to achieve long-term and large-scale political goals such as providing universal healthcare, high-level education and social security. These approaches remain useful in exceptional circumstances and for a small range of goals, but they will neither revolutionize society nor genuinely threaten global capitalism. In the case of both neighborhood assemblies and worker-controlled factories, we see that the primary organizational models of horizontalism are insufficient. They are often reactive tactics that fail to compete in the antagonistic environment of global capitalism. On a theoretical level, and in the actual experiences of Occupy and Argentina, The limits of horizontalism have repeatedly been made clear over the past decade. While recognizing the important capacity of horizontalist tactics to provide small-scale support to communities and to temporarily disrupt certain exploitative practices, the commitment to fetishized versions of consensus, direct action, and particularly prefigurative politics, constrains the possibilities of expanding and overtaking existing social systems. Localism. Less politically radical than horizontalism, though no less ubiquitous, is localism. As an ideology, localism extends far beyond the left, inflecting the politics of pro-capitalists, anti-capitalists, radicals and mainstream culture alike, as a new kind of political common sense. Shared between all of these is a belief that the abstraction and sheer scale of the modern world is at the root of our present political, ecological and economic problems, and that the solution therefore lies in adopting a small is beautiful approach to the world. Small-scale actions, local economies, immediate communities, face-to-face interaction, all of these responses characterize the localist worldview. In a time when most of the political strategies and tactics developed in the 19th and 20th centuries appear blunted and ineffectual, localism has a seductive logic to it. In all its diverse variants, from center-right communitarianism to ethical consumerism, developmental microloans, and contemporary anarchist practice, the promise it offers to do something concrete, enabling political action with immediately noticeable effects, is empowering on an individual level. But this sense of empowerment can be misleading. The problem with localism is that, in attempting to reduce large-scale systemic problems to the more manageable sphere of the local community, it effectively denies the systemically interconnected nature of today's world. Problems such as global exploitation, planetary climate change, rising surplus populations, and the repeated crises of capitalism are abstract in appearance, complex in structure, and non-localized. Though they touch upon every locality, they are never fully manifested in any particular region. Fundamentally, these are systemic and abstract problems, requiring systemic and abstract responses. While much of the populist localism on the right can easily be dismissed as regressive macho fantasy, for example, secessionist libertarianism, sinister ideological cover for austerity economics, the UK Conservative Party's Big Society, or downright racist, the nationalist or fascist blaming of immigrants for structural economic problems, the localism of the left has been less thoroughly scrutinized. Though undoubtedly well-meaning, both the radical and mainstream left partake in localist politics and economics to their detriment. In what follows we will critically examine two of the more popular variants, local food and economic localism, which in very different areas exemplify the problematic dynamics of localism in general. Local food. With a cachet that reaches far beyond typical political circles, localism has recently come to dominate discussions of the production, distribution and consumption of food. Most influential here have been the interlinked movements known as slow food and locavorism, eating locally. The slow food movement began in the mid-1980s in Italy, partly as a protest against the ever-increasing encroachment of fast food chains. Slow food, as its name suggests, stands for everything McDonald's does not: local food, traditional recipes, slow eating and highly skilled production. It is food that offers the most visceral embodiment of the benefits of the slow lifestyle, overcoming the vicissitudes of fast-paced capitalism by returning to an older culture of savoring meals and traditional production techniques. But even its proponents admit that there are difficulties involved in living the slow food lifestyle. Few of us have the time, money, energy or discipline to be a model slow foodie. Without an assessment of how our lives are structured by social, political and economic pressures that make it easier to eat pre-prepared food than embrace the slow food lifestyle, the end result is a variant of ethical consumerism with a hedonistic twist. It is patently correct that taking one's time to enjoy a well-prepared meal can be a pleasurable experience. Paying attention to a meal recasts the experience from one of pure utility into a more social and aesthetic experience. But there are structural reasons why we do not choose to do this often, reasons that are not the result of any individual moral failing. The structure of work, for example, is a primary reason why many of us are unable to enjoy slow eating, or meals prepared according to the ideals of the slow food movement. Slow food might not always require money, but it always requires time. For those who have to work multiple jobs to support their families, time is at a premium. What is more, the gender politics of slow food are problematic, given that we live in patriarchal societies where the majority of food preparation is still presumed to be the task of wives and mothers. While fast food or pre-prepared meals might be unhealthy, their popularity enables the freeing up of women to live lives that are less marked by the everyday drudgery of feeding their families. As innocent as it may at first seem, the slow food movement, like many other forms of ethical consumerism, fails to think in large-scale terms about how its ideas might work within the broader context of rapacious capitalism. Closely linked to the slow food movement are localism and the 100-mile diet, a food politics that emphasizes eating locally. Localism holds that locally sourced food is not only more likely to be healthy, but is also a vital component of our efforts to reduce carbon outputs, and hence our impact on the environment. It situates itself, therefore, as a response to a global issue. Moreover, localism claims to be one way to overcome the alienation of our relationship to food under capitalism. By eating food grown or produced in our locality, so this logic runs, we will be able to get back in touch with the production of our food and reclaim it from the dead hands of a capitalism that has run amok. Compared to the slow food movement, localism positions itself more explicitly, and politically, against globalization. In doing so, it appeals to a constellation of folk political ideas relating to the primacy of the local as a horizon of political action, and of the virtues of the local over the global, the immediate over the mediated, the simple over the complex. These ideas condense often complex environmental issues into questions of individual ethics. One of the most serious, and intrinsically collective, crises of our times is thus effectively privatized. This personalized environmental ethic is exemplified in localist food politics, in particular, in the moral and price premium placed on locally grown food. Here we find ecologically motivated arguments for reducing energy expenditure by reducing the distances over which food is transported, for example, combined with class differentiation, in the form of marketing designed to promote identification with organic food. Similarly, complex problems are condensed into poorly formulated shorthand. For instance, the idea of food miles, identifying the distances that food products have traveled, so as to reduce carbon outputs, appears a reasonable one. The problem is that it is all too often taken to be sufficient on its own as a guide to ethical action. As a 2005 report by the UK's Department of Agriculture and Food found, while the environmental impacts of transporting food were indeed considerable, a single indicator based on total food miles was inadequate as a measure of sustainability. Most notably, the food miles metric emphasizes an aspect of food production that contributes a relatively small amount to overall carbon outputs. When it is simply assumed that small is beautiful, we can all too easily ignore the fact that the energy costs associated with producing food locally may well exceed the total costs of transporting it from a more suitable climate. Even for the purpose of assessing the contribution of food transportation, food miles are a poor metric. Air freight, for example, makes up a relatively small portion of total food miles, but it makes up a disproportionately large slice of total food-related CO2 emissions. The energy consumption involved in putting food on our plates is important, but it cannot be captured in anything as simple as food miles, or in the idea that local is best. Indeed, highly inefficient local food production techniques may be more costly than efficiently grown globally sourced foodstuffs. The bigger question here relates to the priorities we place on the types of food we produce, how that production is controlled, who consumes that food and at what cost. Localist food politics flattens the complexities it is trying to resolve into a simplistic binary: global, bad; local, good. What is needed, By contrast, are less simplistic ways of looking at complex problems, an analysis that takes into account the global food system as a whole, rather than intuitive shorthand formulae such as food miles, or organic versus non-organic foods. It is likely that the ideal method of global food production will be some complex mixture of local initiatives, industrial farming practices, and global systems of distribution. It is equally likely that an analysis capable of calculating the best means to grow and distribute food lies outside the grasp of any individual consumer, requiring significant technical knowledge, collective effort, and global coordination. None of this is well served by a culture that simply values the local. Local economics. Localism, in all its forms, represents an attempt to abjure the problems and politics of scale involved in large systems such as the global economy, politics, and the environment. Our problems are increasingly systemic and global, and they require an equally systemic response. Action must always to some extent occur at the local level, and indeed some localist ideas, such as resiliency, can be useful. But localism as ideology goes much further, rejecting the systemic analysis that might guide and coordinate instances of local action to confront, oppose, and potentially supplant oppressive instances of global power or looming planetary threats. Nowhere is the inability of localist solutions to challenge complex global problems more apparent than in movements towards localized business, banking, and economics. Since the 2008 financial crisis, there have been a number of trends on the broad left towards reforming our economic and monetary systems. While much of this work is useful, one prominent strand has focused on transforming economic systems through localization. The problem with big business, so the thinking goes, is not so much its inherently exploitative nature but the scale of the enterprises involved. Smaller businesses and banks would supposedly be more reflective of the local community's needs. One popular recent campaign, the Move Your Money movement, centered on the idea that, if it was the scale of banks that was to blame for the financial crisis, then customers ought to move their funds collectively to smaller, more virtuous institutions. Ethical consumerist campaigns like this offer a semblance of effective action. They provide a meaningful narrative about the problems of the system and indicate the simple and pain-free action necessary to resolve it. As with most folk political actions, it has all the appearances and feeling of having done something. Major banks are positioned as the bad guys, and individuals can supposedly produce significant effects just by moving their money into smaller, local banks and credit unions. What this model neglects is the complex abstractions of the modern banking system. Money circulates as immediately global and immediately interconnected with every other market. In any situation where a small bank or credit union has more deposits than it is able to profitably reinvest within its locality, it will inevitably seek investments within the broader financial system. Indeed, a reading of the accounts of smaller banks in the United States reveals that they partake in and contribute to the same global financial markets as everyone else, investing in treasury, mortgage or corporate bonds while often participating in socially destructive lending practices that equal those of the major banks. While clearly a reformist measure, Move Your Money might at least have been expected to lead to some transformations in the composition of the U.S. banking system. However, as of September 2013, total assets held by the 6 largest U.S. banks had increased by 37% since the financial crisis. Indeed, by every available measure, the big U.S. banks are larger today than at the beginning of the crisis, holding 67% of all assets in the U.S. banking system. And while legislative efforts across the world have made some attempts to impose restraints on the activities that led to the crisis, requiring increased capital asset ratios and regular stress tests designed to avoid further bailouts, risky lending continues, and risky derivatives holdings remain at staggeringly high levels. If localist efforts to constrain the size of the largest banks appear doomed to failure, what are we to make of alternative campaigns to replicate some of the local banks that make up much of the continental European banking system? For example, 70% of the German banking sector consists of community or smaller-sized banks. German and Swiss community banks, their proponents argue, pool risks collectively and are mutually owned, with high degrees of autonomy to take advantage of local knowledge, and as a result generally remained profitable throughout the financial crisis. It is also argued that local banks of this type are more likely to lend to small businesses than the larger institutions that are more common in the United States and the UK. There are advantages to some local banking models, but their stability is often overstated. For example, despite being highly localized and under community control, Spain's community banks, the Cajas, took significant risks in the property market and other speculative investments in the 2000s, necessitating thoroughgoing financial restructuring after the 2008 crisis. Though under the alleged control of boards with community representation, investment decisions were effectively taken with little proper oversight. Localization here meant the politicization of allegedly disinterested governance boards, turning some cajas into platforms for local government investment in speculative property schemes, as a culture of cronyism took hold. With the worst of Spain's banking crisis centered on the local banks, restructuring meant the merging of local banks to form larger institutions. Even in Germany, often touted as having the best localized banking system in the world, there were issues with some regional banks. The Landesbanken, for example, were heavily invested in structured credit products that performed particularly poorly during the financial crisis. The lesson to draw from this is that there is nothing inherent in smaller institutions that will enable them to resist the worst excesses of contemporary finance, and that the idea of cleanly separating the local from the global is today impossible. Political capture, the need to seek profitable investments beyond those available in the local area, and simply the high returns of more risky investments, are all factors leading local banks to participate in the broader financial system. Even mutual ownership is no guarantee of financial probity, as demonstrated by the recent travails of the UK's cooperative bank, which almost collapsed entirely following an ill-conceived takeover of a building society in 2009. The systemic problems of the financial system can only be properly dealt with by taking apart financial power, whether by means of broad regulation, as was briefly achieved under post-war Keynesianism, or more revolutionary methods. Fetishizing the small and the local seems to be a means of simply ignoring the more significant ways in which the system could be transformed for the better. Resistance is futile. A folk political sentiment has manifested itself in both radical horizontalist and more moderate localist movements, yet similar intuitions underpin a broad range of the contemporary left. Across these groups, a series of judgments are widely accepted: small is beautiful, the local is ethical, simpler is better, permanence is oppressive, progress is over. These kinds of ideas are favored over any counter-hegemonic project, a politics that might contend with capitalist power at the largest scales. At its heart, much of contemporary folk politics therefore expresses a deep pessimism. It assumes we can't make large-scale, collective social change. This defeatist attitude runs amok on the left, and perhaps with good reason, considering the continued failures of the past 30 years. For center-left political parties, nostalgia for a lost past is the best that can be hoped for. The most radical content to be found here consists of dreams of social democracy and the so-called golden age of capitalism. Yet the very conditions which once made social democracy possible no longer exist. The capitalist golden age was predicated on the production paradigm of the orderly factory environment, where, white, male, workers received security and a basic standard of living in return for a lifetime of stultifying boredom and social repression. Such a system depended on an international hierarchy of empires, colonies and an underdeveloped periphery, a national hierarchy of racism and sexism, and a rigid family hierarchy of female subjugation. Moreover, social democracy relied on a particular balance of forces between classes, and a willingness for compromise between them, and even this was only possible in the wake of the unprecedented destruction caused by the Great Depression and World War II, and in the face of external threats from communism and fascism. For all the nostalgia many may feel, this regime is both undesirable and impossible to recover. But the more pertinent point is that even if we could go back to social democracy, we should not. We can do better, and the social democratic adherence to jobs and growth means it will always err on the side of capitalism and at the expense of the people. Rather than modeling our future on a nostalgic past, we should aim to create a future for ourselves. The move beyond the constraints of the present will not be achieved through a return to a more humanized capitalism reconstructed from a misty-eyed recollection of the past. While nostalgia for a lost past is clearly not an adequate response, neither is today's widespread glorification of resistance. Resistance always means resistance against another active force. In other words, it is a defensive and reactive gesture, rather than an active movement. We do not resist a new world into being, we resist in the name of an old world. The contemporary emphasis on resistance therefore belies a defensive stance towards the encroachments of expansionary capitalism. Trade unions, for instance, position themselves as resisting neoliberalism with demands to save our health system or stop austerity, but these demands simply reveal a conservative disposition at the heart of the movement. According to these demands, the best one can hope for is small impediments in the face of a predatory capitalism. We can only struggle to keep what we already have, as limited and crisis-ridden as it may be. Even in left-leaning Latin America this trend is visible, with the most significant successes largely around efforts to impede transnational corporations, particularly in relation to mining. In many circles resistance has come to be glorified, obscuring the conservative nature of such a stance behind a veil of radical rhetoric. Resistance is seen to be all that is possible, while constructive projects are nothing but a dream. While it can be important in some circumstances, in the task of building a new world, resistance is futile. Other movements argue for an approach of withdrawal, whereby individuals exit from existing social institutions. Horizontalism is closely linked to this approach, being predicated on the rejection of existing institutions and the creation of autonomous forms of community. Indeed, the recent history of activism has tended towards such approaches. Often these approaches are explicitly opposed to complex societies, meaning that the ultimate implied destination is some form of communitarianism or anarcho-primitivism. Others suggest making oneself invisible in order to evade detection and repression by the state. At the extreme, some argue for what amounts to a left-wing survivalism: civilization is in catastrophe, and we should therefore become invisible, retreat to small communes, and learn how to grow food, hunt, heal and defend ourselves. If left at the level of survivalism, these kinds of positions, while perhaps unappealing, would at least have some consistency. They at least have the virtue of being open about their implications. However, arguments for withdrawal and exit too easily confuse the idea of a social logic separate from capitalism with a social logic that is antagonistic to capitalism, or, in an even stronger claim, that poses a threat to capitalist logics. Yet capitalism has been and will continue to be compatible with a wide range of different practices and autonomous spaces. The Spanish town of Marinaleda offers a useful example of this. Over the course of 3 decades, this small community has built up a communist utopia that has expropriated land, built its own housing and cooperatives, kept living costs low, and provided work for everyone. Yet the limits of such an approach for transforming capitalism are quickly revealed. Housing materials are provided by the regional government, agricultural subsidies come from the European Union, jobs are sustained by the rejection of labor-saving devices, income still comes from selling goods on wider capitalist markets, and businesses remain subjected to capitalist competition and the global financial crisis. Marinaleda is but one example of how the project of withdrawing, escaping or exiting from capitalism is still contained within a folk political horizon, within which defending small bunkers of autonomy against the onslaught of capitalism is the best that can be hoped for. Yet we would argue not only that more can be hoped for, and achieved, but that, in the absence of broad and systematic contention, even those small pockets of resistance are likely to be swiftly eradicated. All politics is local. Horizontalism, localism, nostalgia, resistance and withdrawal all embody, to greater or lesser degrees, folk political intuitions about how to do politics. and they all remain inadequate for the task of transforming capitalism. But this is not to say that they should be rejected in their entirety. As the rest of the book will make clear, there are a number of important elements to retain from these approaches. Rather than being intrinsically malign, folk politics is simply partial, temporary, and insufficient. Various horizontalist approaches, for example, have raised important questions about power, domination, and hierarchy, but they have not developed adequate responses to them. Folk politics as a tendency retreats from the difficulty of these problems by attempting to dispel them from the outset. Yet, in a world where dominance, power, hierarchy, and exploitation are imposed upon us, such questions must be confronted directly, rather than retreated from. Likewise, in a banal sense, all politics is local. We act upon things in our immediate vicinity in order to change larger political structures. We cannot simply reject the local. But today's folk political tendencies invoke a stronger sense of local politics, a retreat into the local in order to avoid the problems of a complex and abstract society, an assumption about the authenticity and naturalness of the local, and a neglect of scalable and sustainable practices that might go beyond the local. While all politics begins within the local, folk politics remains local. In the end, a significant part of the problem with folk politics lies less in the particular tactics and practices it tends to adhere to than in the overarching strategic vision into which it is placed. Protests, marches, occupations, sit-ins and blockades all have their place. None of these tactics in themselves are fundamentally folk political. But when they are marshaled by a strategic vision that sees temporary and small-scale changes as the horizon of success, or when they are extrapolated beyond the particular conditions that made them effective, they are inevitably going to be bound up within folk political thinking. If the tactic of occupation, for example, is employed in order to create exemplars and temporary spaces of non-capitalist social relations, it will inevitably fail to achieve substantial change. If, on the other hand, it is understood as a mechanism to produce solidarity networks and mobilize them for further action, then it may still have use within broader counter-hegemonic strategies. But this sort of strategic reflection about the virtues and limits of any particular action is what is absent from too much of the left today. The numerous protests and marches and occupations typically operate without any sense of strategy, simply acting as dispersed and independent blips of resistance. There is far too little thought given to how to combine these various actions, and how they might function together to collectively build a better world. Instead, we are left with actions that sometimes succeed but which rarely have an overarching eye to how this contributes to medium and long-term goals. In the next chapter, we look at how the right undertook such strategic reflection and orchestrated a situation in which neoliberalism became the dominant common sense of our time.